Good morning and welcome to Mass Memorial Virtual Sunday School. Theme for the quarter, Stewardship and Missions, Our Obligation as Christians. Unit 2, Fulfilling Our Obligations to Family and Community, Sunday, April 12, 2026. Lesson titled, Whose Rules Rules? In other words, whose word has the ultimate authority, or does one take precedent over the other? Mark 12, 17, Romans 13, 1, 6 through 8, 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. These are our scriptures for this lesson. The key verse, Jesus answering said unto them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God that are God's. And they marvel at him. This is from Mark 12, 17. King James Version. The aim for this lesson is to analyze God's directive for relating to just government authorities, to honor God through intentional prayer for elected leaders, thoughtfully engage in civic and public life. A good aim for today's lesson. A little bit on our background. We're not going into a lot of detail because we've had these books before. Book of Mark, this is the second book of 4 Gospels in the New Testament, and the writing of this book is attributed to John Mark, who is believed to be a companion and interpreter of the Apostle Peter. He basically remained anonymous in all the other writings. He recorded the eyewitness testimonies and works of Peter's teaching. There are several themes in the book of Mark, and that deals with the kingdom of God, the cost of discipleship, Masonic secrets, and Jesus' actions, showing his divine power and authority over sickness and demons. In the first century, the church was in a tense state over jurisdiction and who was in charge, and this is where our lesson begins. The other book included in our lesson background is the book of Romans. The book of Romans is the 6th book in the New Testament and the longest of all the books written by Paul. The main message to the Romans is that the gospel of Jesus Christ is for both Jews and Gentiles and available to all who believe through faith alone, rather than by works of the law. Paul was known as the apostle to the Gentiles and had allegiances to both Jews and Romans as well. In our past lesson, we remember that Peter thought that the gospel was only for the Jews until he had his dream and realized that the gospel is for everyone. The book of 1 Peter, authored by Peter, the Jew of the diaspora, which means he was over all the areas where the Jews had moved outside of Jerusalem. Peter's main message was to encourage Christians to maintain hope, holiness, and endurance while suffering from their faith in a hostile world. Peter taught the exiles and their true identity was in Christ. Peter constantly urged them to stand firm, do good, and live in anticipation of future restoration, which would bring joy in the midst of suffering. We're moving on to our lesson scriptures. And we got one verse in Mark 12, 17. And this unit is just this one verse. It says, Render to Caesar and to God. That's the subtitle. Mark 12, 17. And Jesus answering said unto them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. This dealt with taxes at the time. That's because the Jews were under the auspices of the Roman Empire and they were required to pay taxes. And so they wanted to know who comes first. Do we pay Roman taxes or do we pay our own tithes and offering? And so these two verses, this verse in particular was one that was directed to Jesus as he came before the Sanhedrin Council. And the Sanhedrin Council was basically run by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These were the elite religious leaders who basically enforced the Jewish law. And so they were also trying to trip Jesus up at the time, because they really wanted him to be tried for treason. And so when he came before the council, they asked him this question, who do we honor? Who do we pay first? And so Jesus made the statement by saying, honor the authority, which also affirms God's claim. And Jesus gave proper due to those who weren't Christians, those who were in charge. And they were amazed at his answers, because he was saying, you give to Caesar what's Caesar's and God to what's God. So he didn't he didn't put one above the other. He said, if Caesar's taxes are due, you pay Caesar. And if God's tithes is due, you pay God. So they were amazed at his answer. Excuse me. In our next part of our lesson, it says, you're the boss. And these verses come from Romans 13:1, Romans 6 through 8. And what I will do, I will read Romans 13:1 and then Romans 13:6 and 13:7. Romans 13:1, let every man be subject to the higher powers, for there are no power but of God, the power that be ordained of God. Romans 13:6, for this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear is due, honor to whom honor is due. In Romans 13:8, owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another has fulfilled the law. And these verses contain a combination of things. Paul's letter to the church at Rome was one of the most significant writings, because he carefully scripted his language to address the essential teachings that shaped the early church, but also addressed the idea that Christians should live under secular authority as well, being that he was both Jewish and Roman in citizenship. So he understood how power and authority worked and did not see the need to overturn the social order. This is important because we know that Paul was a big persecutor of Christians before he was changed. And so he understood Roman law. He was one of the big Roman leaders in terms of persecuting the Christian. But in these verses, he's saying he understood their concern. The Jews were concerned with how can they pay the emperor his fees and then do their own tithe and offering. And so because Christianity was still young, Paul believed that the people needed to coexist peacefully with the rulers to avoid unnecessary conflict. And that's an important fact. And even for us today, even though we be Christians, we also need to learn how to live peacefully under government rules and regulations. And so that was one of the things Paul continually stressed to this newfound Christian church. And he said, you must obey those that's in charge. He said, if rulers and leaders have power, it is only because God allowed it. And that's one thing that we have to come to grips with today, that, we see leaders that are not good leaders, but we have to also know that God is still in control. And one thing that this lesson brings to bear is that no one has power but authority except what God gives them. And so that's one point that we really need to keep in mind in today's world. Sometimes we say, well, when are things coming to a halt, or when is God going to do this? But everything is done for a reason. And we need to learn to peacefully coexist as well as we can under the law of our own laws. And so that's kind of what Paul was saying. You need to respect authority, but also you have to coexist peacefully. And so that brings us to our next section of verses, Christian freedom. Christianity doesn't give you the right to break the law. I think it's what Paul was trying to get over. Like he told the church at Rome, you don't need to upset the social order, to get God's point across. And that's something that we need to think about. You don't upset things. You don't bring the distractions and war and crime just because you say you're a Christian, but I have to do this because I'm a Christian. No, that's not what this lesson is about. It's about living peacefully with authority. And on that note, I'm going to read 1 Peter 2:13, 2:14, and 2:15. 1 Peter 2:13, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be a king as supreme, or unto governors, which is 14, as unto them that are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. 1 Peter 2:15. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may be put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. This, going back to, again, Paul is urging the church to abide by the ordinances and rules of the governors of the king. Whatever that rule is, you need to abide by it. And like I said, the biggest concern here was the fact that the Jews had to pay taxes to the Roman emperor. And, this kind of lesson, during this particular time, we know it's tax time. And it says the taxes have been around a very, very long time. And they have been collected in many different ways. We know taxes weren't always through money. They were through bartering, or selling a property, or taxing a property, different ways that those in authority collected taxes before now. So it's something that we have to do because it's the law. And this lesson is saying abide by the law. You don't have to upset the social order. Because if we know that if you don't pay taxes, there is a consequence for not paying taxes. And that's what Paul is saying. Christians don't need to get involved in trying to change that. Just abide by the law peacefully. And he also stipulates in verse 14 and 15 that evildoers will be punished, and praises will go out to them that abide and do well. And also in verse 15, he's saying that when you do well, you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. It's kind of like letting somebody just hang themselves, if you want to put it that way. They keep doing wrong, and righteousness always win out. It might not be quick, but right will always win out. And so that's what Paul is saying. If you do well, then you can put the ignorance to silence. It's like we always say a person can't argue with themselves. So sometimes if somebody's arguing, just be quiet, let them go on. Eventually they will stop when they realize there is no audience, or there's no response from their ranting. So that's basically what these verses are saying. And this all involves, going back to this title, Christian freedom. And so, as Christians, we have the freedom to do many things, but they must be within the law. Okay, 1 Peter 2:16 and 1 Peter 2:17. As free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servant of God. 1 Peter 2:17. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Just reinforcement that even though you're a Christian, you don't use that to do harm. You know, some people are very arrogant Christians, and they use that to make different rules that are not necessarily what God wants them to use it for. Some people can be malicious. Even, this lesson applies to leaders. That could be ministers, that could be governors, that could be policemen. And it says, don't use your Christianity to be negative as a cloak of maliciousness, but use it as a servant of God. And when you carry yourself in that manner, people see that. If you're out here being nasty in public, they see that. But if you carry yourself in a manner that people can say, well, there's something different about that person. And so this is what verse 16 is saying. But be a servant of God. Carry yourself in that manner in all things. And most important, verse 2:17 actually goes back to the first commandment, to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And it says, honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Didn't leave out the king. This goes back to respecting authority. And so this is a good lesson for us today, because we know we have some leaders that are pretty hard to deal with, because sometimes we think they have no sense of humanity. But this lesson also says that they have no power but except for what God gives them. So that's the part we need to keep in mind. And on that note, we look at the practical applications of this lesson. In today's lesson, whose rules rule it, is simply asking the question, on whose law do we follow? For the early church, they were constantly tense because they had their Jewish law, they had their Roman laws, and what God required of them. Even today, we see those who don't know what laws they should follow. Paul made it clear that the early Christians should live under a secular authority, and they did not need to overturn the social order. In 1 Peter, it says to submit yourself to every ordinance of men for the Lord's sake. Submission does not mean blind obedience, because human rulers, leaders, are flawed and sometimes act from selfish motives. And we know this, and if you remember here a few months ago, there was a upheaval in our government because some of the leaders said, if it's wrong, don't obey the order. So this is what this lesson is about. Not blind obedience, because human rulers and leaders are flawed, and sometimes they act in selfish motives. And so that's what this lesson is also saying. You abide by the law as long as you know that and feel that it's right. But if somebody tell you to go out there and shoot somebody in the head because they are a general and that person hasn't done anything, then you need to think about what you're doing. And that's all this lesson is saying. There's implications for following God's rule and following man's rule. And Paul was trying to bring them both together by saying you must do both. But you also must know when not to do it. And so that's basically, he didn't give the Jews an out for paying taxes, is basically what this lesson was about. Because they wanted Paul to say, and these Pharisees wanted Jesus to say, Don't pay the Roman taxes. If you didn't pay Roman taxes, you could end up dead. Or they would come and confiscate all your property, all your slaves, all your animals, and everything. So Jesus didn't give them a way out, and neither did Paul give them a way out. They both said, respect authority, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Obey those that's in charge. Also, if we look back at the 10 Commandments that God initially gave the Israelites to follow while they were in the wilderness, many of our laws today are centered on these basic commandments. And it centers around loving God and your neighbor as yourself. And so this is what Paul ended his lesson on. Is respect authority, love those that's in charge, and you'll be able to live peacefully. And a more peaceful world is needed, as we know. And if we apply this principle to each person we meet, and they in turn see the result of love, kindness, and respect, then we can change the world, one person at a time. So I hope that this lesson will give you something to reflect on as we go about our daily task. It's a pretty simple lesson. It's saying, give to Caesar what's Caesar, respect the law, and love each other. Those are the 3 things that's brought out in this lesson. So on that note, I will hope that you will continue to join us in our virtual presentation each Sunday. Thank you for listening.